Hello everyone and welcome to Media Voices. I'm Esther Thorpe, 1/3 of the Media Voices team, and I'm really excited to introduce the first episode of this 4-part series looking at future-proofing local news, supported by the Google News Initiative. Over the next few weeks we'll be talking to some of the publishers working to find resilient business models, how they've evolved company culture and practice to do this, and what tools and trends they're working with to prepare for the next decade. Now, even if local news isn't your bag, there are still some real deep dives into internal transformation, fostering collaboration, and lessons about the importance of good content to mean that there's something for everyone to take away, so do stay tuned. This first episode, though, is a big picture look at the state of the market. Just to note too that we've chosen to speak to primarily UK and European publishers, as the local news markets elsewhere in the world are incredibly varied. If you're interested in US local news specifically, we already have a special documentary episode on savouring local news in the US, which we'll link to in the show notes on voices.media. And just a final note to say, please excuse my pronunciation of some publications throughout the episode. It's not my strong point. So let's get into it. Here, we're going to look at some of the historical context around local news, shifts in the UK and European markets, and what good local news might look like. First up, we spoke to Doug Smith, lead architect at Table Stakes. Table Stakes is a programme for local and regional news organisations to help them drive digital revenue growth by refocusing on audiences. Over 30 organisations have taken part in Table Stakes Europe in partnership with the Google News Initiative Digital Growth Programme. As well as leading Table Stakes Europe, Doug has also led it in the US and has worked with hundreds of organisations on innovation, strategy and growth in industries undergoing huge changes. Here he gives us a big picture overview of how the local news market got to this point.
As a taking off point in the United States, 20 years ago, the technology tsunami wave crashed over journalism and news media broadly. That includes local, but it goes beyond local. Once we had search and social platforms, news was disintermediated. People could go direct to one another and to the platforms to get news and information. We all know that. It's also the case that if you look at print, so newspapers, and if you looked at TV, not radio and not magazines, but TV and print newspapers, from the late 1940s through the 1990s into the 21st century, were oligopolistic market structures, which means a few players controlled the lion's share of the markets. This is crucial because that was not the case with newspapers 100 years ago. There was tremendous local competition. The market structure was competitive, not oligopolistic or even monopolistic, depending where you were. What happens when the markets move toward oligopoly? You have few competitors controlling the market. That's when there's a heightened sensitivity to what in journalism is known as church versus state. The newsroom versus what was called for so long the business side. That's all because of First Amendment concerns, and that's also because of concerns about corruption, about advertisers or whomever having undue influence on the news content, on the editorials, perspective, etc. We all know this. This is crucial because from the late 40s through, for 50 years, quite literally, if you looked at the organization chart, the hierarchy, the structure of a news enterprise, there was only one general manager, the CEO or the publisher, depending on title. We used organization structure to literally divide those who produced the content from those who earned the revenue. Okay, get to the late 1990s when the digital tsunami wave hits. Now you're in a situation where any news enterprise, there's an absolute premium on innovation, on figuring it out. I've worked in more than 60 industries and fields in all three sectors: for profit, NGO, government. I can't think of any industry or field in which I've worked that had the juxtaposition of blowing up the business at a time when you only had one general manager. That general manager perspective is crucial to innovation and change. It just should make common sense to everybody that if you don't have people who are thinking of the whole enterprise, they're going to be less adept at figuring out what to do. So that's the big backdrop to what occurred in the US. And in Europe, there are similarities to that.
But it's not just management structures that have got us to this point. Doug points out that in the US, there were some complex financial pressures which are still having an impact today.
What's the other byproduct, wonderful byproduct of oligopolistic market structures? If you're an oligopolistic player, a monopolistic player, you make a lot of money. I mean, if you went back to the 1970s or 80s in the newspaper business, many people would say they don't print newspapers, they print money. So you have oligopolistic financial performance. It just goes with any market structure like that, whether you're talking automobiles, breakfast cereal, whatever. That now today the search and social platforms, they print money, right? Because of their market power. So a couple of more things happened. One, there was consolidation that was going on in the 80s and 90s because these profit-making machines were very attractive. So many groups started buying other groups, and they bought them on the premise of cash flow from what was before, not what was to come after. So many overpaid and incurred a lot of debt. The other thing that happened in the US was a lot of pension liabilities built up that were very affordable to cash machines, became less so. So you had a couple of things. You had owners with very high expectations for returns. You had debt and pension obligations that were quite heavy. When you now go to what is in fact a competitive market structure, and indeed even worse than that because of the dominance of the platforms, you're a tiny little competitor compared to what happened to all the advertising, the classified, and so on. This is why that in the late 90s going into early 2000s, the business model is broken. The business model is broken. We have to find a new business model. This is why there were all those things. What I'm trying to point out is decision makers were all of a sudden thrust into a different set of waters, and their own expectations and their own ways of thinking were not really applicable, and yet from a legacy mindset standpoint of view, it kept going.
So what was one of the first things that happened? Publishing's original sin.
99% of newspapers gave their content away for free on the web. 99%. And because why? Because they thought, oh, well, this is interesting. This is a channel to get people to subscribe to our print newspaper. That's really what they thought. Now, this doesn't make them stupid. It just makes them human. 99%. I mean, it wasn't like 50-50 and there was a debate. That has such repercussions because that started happening in the late 1990s. It takes 20 years before the majority of local newspapers are starting to put up paywalls. 20 years. Think deeply for a moment about that. For 20 years, newspapers communicated to new audiences, it's free. Trained new audiences to expect news and information for free. At a kind of a deep level, this again was not intentional, but at a kind of a very deep level, the publishers were putting zero value on their product.
Let's zoom in a little bit and look at the state of local news in Europe. Here's a last word from Doug on why there's such a difference between the state of local news there and the much better known challenges publishers face in the United States.
Europe is different from the United States, because in the United States, we have 350 million people, the vast majority of whom speak a single language. So yes, we have many Hispanic speaking people and some other immigrant populations with different languages. It's nothing like Europe. Come on, just look at a map of Europe and you're looking at a map of languages. That actually crucially matters to all of this, because I know I'm stating generalizations. There are many, many contrary points. But from a big picture perspective, Europe has a more vital continuing reality to local identities than the US does. So that really is crucial for the table stakes Europe work, because the local media, even regional or national media in Europe, have a competitive advantage in language that doesn't exist for Arkansas or Washington or Idaho.
In Germany, there's also been a concerning decline in subscriptions. Local newspapers used to be a dominant source of local news, but despite decline, there's still a need for local information. Professor Dr. Wibke Moving, Professor of Journalism at TU Dortmund Institute for Journalism, explains.
We see a very concerning declining of the subscriptions, especially for a newspaper. Maybe just to make it clear, local newspapers were till now the main and very dominant source of getting proper local news. And we see a decline. And on the other hand, we see a rise of the need for local information. And that's quite of a dilemma. You have, on the one hand, you have a very high rise and very high numbers of people who say they are very interested in what happens in their local surroundings. And on the other hand, we have the decline of the local newspapers. And we see the struggling of local medias that were funded now, and they are looking for new finance business models. And we see the struggling of getting well paid, or at least paid. Let's not say well paid. So that's really it's a problem and it's a dilemma.
Germany doesn't have the problem of news deserts, where large regions without a news source, in the same way that the US has. But the industry has faced a lot of consolidation in the country, and this is reflected across many other European countries.
The local newspaper market in Germany is on another ground than maybe that in the US. We have around 300 newspaper titles. And they are covering, right now we have no news deserts like maybe in the US. So it's right now, till now we have, let's say, in every little community, there is the possibility to get some news in a newspaper. But I do have to comment this. We have a decline. I don't have the right number right now on my head, but we see over the last 10 or let's say 15 years a concentration process, and there is a couple of titles that vanished, or that's the more common way, title that they work together now, and every new they both titles keep their own titles, but they work together in one unit. So it looks like they were different titles, but in fact, there's a lot of common and shared content. Because of the fact that the distribution areas are getting bigger and bigger, because the title work together, they have less resources, at least human resources, to covering the whole area in a proper way. So they then send maybe freelancers, but because they're not paying a proper salary, it's like you often have non-professional freelancers then, especially in the sub-local areas. And that is a problem if it's not comes to covering maybe the cultural topics. I think it's fine for that. But if it comes to watch and to comment what is going on political area, and we have a strong, the lowest ground of democracy. It's like Kommunalebene, covering the political processes on the municipal level that have to be done by a professional. So at least that you know what questions you have to ask, what rights do you have when it comes to deeper research and stuff like that.
Dr. Vibke believes that the root of the issue, both in Europe and elsewhere, is that news organisations forgot about the needs of their users, something which left them exposed as the digital age began.
Maybe one big mistake is that I think for too long, newspaper houses trusted on their importance. They just weren't thinking of that people might think it's irrelevant to have good journalism. Because from our democratic perspective, there is, of course, a highly need for proper, well done, good professional journalism, because people need to be informed in a good way to perform in a democratic way. And that is, from this perspective, there's no way that good local journalism is a very highly need and a very important one. But from the perspective of the users, it's like, I think when I took my first classes in local journalism as a student, I already learned, and that is now over 30 years ago, there was a warning that newspapers has to watch properly if they fit the needs of the users. So they were asked and they were pleaded to put more the perspective of the users into their decisions. And I would say you can now, even now, 30 years later, you can offer the same recommendation to newspaper houses, because they aren't very good in change themselves. But coming to the point, what's going on, and if there are some good news, I think that there is some change right now, because the economic problems are so high now, because if you don't have money to do good journalism or to do journalism at all, you have to rethink your business model on the one hand side, and then you have to rethink your product. And I think this is right now so obvious that in the bigger media houses, as well as like in the little ones, they really try to find out what are new ways, like WhatsApp newsletters, like podcast is a very big thing in German right now. It's over the last years, local podcast like that. You on the way to the work, you can just put on your headphones and there's someone who reads in half an hour all the important news for you, what's going on in your neighborhood, so that you, when you are at work, you're informed about your city.
Another European publisher we'll hear from over this series is Roy Catherine Strasbourg, a local news site covering Strasbourg, a city in northeastern France. Co-founder Pierre explained that other major regional sources in the country didn't go into much depth, which opened up an opportunity for them.
Well, I think it's the bet on in-depth journalism. That's something at the local level people don't have much. If you look at the news ecosystem, you have one major source, which is in Strasbourg, the Dernière Nouvelle d'Alsace, DNA. They produce daily news on a daily basis, obviously, but they don't produce much in-depth journalism. It's mostly surface news. What has happened? It's day-to-day coverage. And they don't produce long form, they don't produce inquiries, they don't produce long interviews, they don't produce 4 articles on one subject, for example. So when we started to do that, we had a lot of success because some of the people of Strasbourg, which often are the same who read the news, it's not all the people of Strasbourg, but a fraction of it likes it, to have in-depth journalism, very important matters of the city being seriously followed. And that principle didn't change. The regional press is a bit of both. It has regional matters and local pages. But the thing is that the metropolitan area is not very much covered. The metropolitan issues, they have an ancient way of segmenting the news with geographical coverage, while we are segmenting the news with community centering. So what we do, we speak to people from Strasbourg, but it can be of subjects that are happening hundreds of kilometers from. We do cover with the prism of being from Strasbourg. So it changes a bit, and it changes the way we relate to news, and we think it's a better way of segmenting the news.
Here in the UK, there are yet another varying set of pressures on local news, which we'll explore in this section. Some of those pressures are very obvious, as we'll hear in a moment, but there are also plenty of green shoots. Bénédicte Autreuil, Google's head of news partnerships for the UK, Ireland and Northern Europe, gives her big picture perspective.
We did some work with the consulting of the FT, looking at a project that is called the Sustainability Diagnostic, or the Sustainability Project. And they interviewed about 400 publishers of all size and shape across the world. And then they came up with a list of archetypes and also trends into what they were seeing. It's fair to say that I suppose the local news sector has historically been more linked to ad revenue as the stream, and that's proven to be very challenging in the recent years. So I think from that perspective, you can see the pressure mounting on those type of publishers. So when they took the diagnostic, so financial sustainability diagnostic, you could see that the sustainability index was much lower if they had less diversification of revenue and relying on advertising. We do see also some green shoots at a hyperlocal level that are very interesting and that are experimenting with new model. And the other thing that we saw was one of the positive effects of the pandemic was that deeper connection with the reader that suddenly was emphasized. And I think that gives me hope for the longer term sustainability. But I only need to look at the UK market, and frankly, you see the consolidation happening right in front of your eyes. And I do worry.
We asked Bénédicte if she was seeing these big UK trends affect the other European markets.
Maybe in the Nordics. In the Nordics, I think they've got a much stronger connection with their readers, and obviously they've diversified much earlier into the reader revenue strength, which is quite interesting because it makes them much more resilient. I think it's happening everywhere, but maybe cross countries. So I'm thinking, for example, of Mediahus, who bought, I think it's the Abendzeitung in Germany. And then I believe Bonnier News is acquiring, some local news assets in different countries. So still a little bit of element, but probably less than in the UK.
Back in 2018, a major review into the sustainability of high-quality journalism in the UK was launched, called the Cairncross Review. It made 9 proposals to save the news industry, some of which the government chose to support, others which it didn't. A group of independent publishers then came together and formed the Public Interest News Foundation in November 2019, with the aim of helping independent news providers and improving public understanding of their work. Executive Director Jonathan Hewood outlined some of the issues the Cairncross Review found with UK local news.
Frances Cairncross was commissioned by the government to look at the state of public interest journalism, and she came back saying, well, it's not a very good state. There's a market failure, particularly at local level, where the economies of the digital media just do not work. If you're, aiming at an audience of 30, 50,000 people, you're not ever going to get the scale that you need to generate significant ad revenue, and nor does it really work if you're going down the niche route. A small proportion of 30 or 50,000 people is not very many people, so that's not really sustainable either. So there is something really, really, really tricky in the local market. And she called for government intervention, and the government basically sort of said, yes, but no. We're not going to go down that road. The long-term challenge for us is that, 3 or 4 years on now, we've obviously been through the pandemic. We're not in a great position economically as a country, and we don't have that culture of journalism philanthropy that you see in the United States, where there's hundreds of millions of dollars a year going into the sector. So it's still very early days in the UK. But I think that the part of the job that I enjoy the most is still working with those smaller indie publishers. They're just a sort of really fantastic bunch of people. If anything gives me cause for optimism, it's their infectious optimism, even if it's sometimes, optimism in the face of experience.
Whatever challenges the industry is facing, optimism is important, as is a recognition that local news still plays a vital part in many communities. Craig Walker is the editor of Press and Journal, a daily regional newspaper covering Northern and Highland Scotland, published by DC Thomson. He emphasised how important a role their titles still play in not just news and campaigning, but celebrating good news stories.
Ultimately, for me, without local news, you wouldn't have the level of scrutiny on decisions being made by local and national governments, which impact people's everyday lives. I think, of course, people campaign for good, and that can't stop and should always continue, but local journalism, local news brands, we're able to grab a good cause and to really mobilise that support very quickly, and to be that voice for good and to support good causes as well. I think I've got a couple of examples just spring to mind, sort of ongoing examples that our titles are involved in, and I think for the Press and Journal, Inverness is the only Scottish city that doesn't have a dual carriageway or motorway links. Change had been promised by the UK government before devolution even happened, and by the Scottish government as well for more than 15 years now. But we're still waiting, and ultimately people of the north of Scotland are still waiting. And after delay, hold-ups, we decided to launch a campaign calling for action to dual the A9, and that was just giving the people of the north that extra voice and being able to put that extra scrutiny and on the government. That's one aspect, I think, or one campaign. I think another one to highlight is our sister title, the Courier in Dundee. They've been campaigning for a number of years for an independent public inquiry after a surgeon at NHS Tayside harmed a huge number of patients. This was finally granted by the Scottish Government just last week, and it means that the victims will have the opportunity for the health board's failings to be scrutinised. And I think, I really do think that without that level of scrutiny and giving people a voice, that wouldn't have happened. I think it's been able to put the pressure on people in power to make sure that something does happen and that people are held accountable. I think as well, local news, we're there to celebrate as well. We're absolutely there to tell good stories. And I think, for us, it's all about the mix. You can focus on the bad and you can highlight where things need to be improved. But I think, you have to provide that different content mix, that different journey through your site or your paper that does entertain as much as anything else as well.
We'll be hearing from more DC Thomson staff later in this series about the importance of the different types of content that local news titles produce. But back to some of the big picture issues. Jonathan Hewood notes that the UK is also struggling with the triopoly of local news companies, which in turn is impacting public perception of the sector.
What worries me is that at the moment you've got three companies between them still controlling the vast majority of the legacy newspaper sector. And that's a problem not only in terms of the economics of it, but in terms of how they actually run those businesses. That has a huge impact on how people perceive local media. So if people think, well, yeah, local media is where I go to find out what time Strictly is on, and occasionally there's a Kim Kardashian story, and there's some crime stories, and every now and then there's a really great story of local journalists who are bothered to sit in courtrooms for month after month following cases like the Lucy Letby case, or journalists who are holding sort of Thurrock Council to account and realising that they've blown hundreds of millions of pounds. But those stories are going to get lost in that overall kind of miasma. And then, like, everyone loses, because the small, noble-spirited people that are trying to build a better culture just get swamped because people think, oh, local news, that's rubbish. I'm not very keen on the model where three companies call all the shots, but I think we've got to look slightly more creatively for ways to work with them. They are the reality. We can't work around them, and the indie publishers are going to continue to be sort of pushing very hard up a downhill slope if the culture is being set by those companies. And as I say, particularly by their shareholders, not necessarily by the editors and the execs, who in many cases are desperate to do a good job.
One of the more unusual challenges UK local news organisations have had to contend with is public notices. David Floyd, Managing Director at community interest company Social Spider, explains how this is stifling revenue for some genuine local news publishers.
Well, there's two things. I suppose one is that currently we have quite a distorted system in terms of the advertising market, because we have public notice advertising, which is the single biggest source of advertising income at a council level, and that is currently subject to quite an archaic system where it can only go out through local news publications that publish at least every 2 weeks or more frequently. So the current situation is, if you publish a weekly newspaper which distributes 800 copies, as some of the corporate publishers do, in a borough with 250,000 residents, you're eligible for an annual public notice contract, which might be worth 80, 90, 100,000 pounds a year. If you publish a monthly newspaper distributing 15,000 copies, or if you distributed 25,000 copies, that doesn't make you able to take on that advertising. And that's obviously, that setup in that anomaly is not anyone's fault. It's not a kind of evil conspiracy. It's a sort of archaic thing that is in place. But from the industry's point of view, the industry has been fighting to make sure public notices continue to exist, and that the government just doesn't abolish it. And that's a very reasonable argument for industry leaders to have been making. But in the process, in areas such as London in particular, but lots of other areas outside the bigger cities, the effect of that has been to effectively prop up these zombie publications which don't do any news reporting, but also are getting very minimal advertising income beyond the public notices and nationally syndicated advertising. And it's not like these corporate groups surviving on a public notice contract are actually selling lots of locally based advertising either. It really is just the public notices that are propping these publications up. So that's a real problem.
One of the terms we hear a lot these days regarding local news, especially when talking about legacy organisations, is managed decline. But David thinks this is simply the companies reacting to market conditions, and that it is those conditions which need changing to promote sustainable local news.
A listed company is always going to react to the market conditions, and the way that some of the corporates in their managed decline model are reacting to the market conditions is a logical reaction to the conditions that have been set up. So it's not really for me to criticise them. It's more to say, how do we change the market conditions so that we reward journalism? For me, my agenda is not that corporate local media groups should go away. I think in some form they need to exist and they have a positive role to play. It's that, are the structures that we have in place rewarding publishers for producing journalism rather than rewarding them for archaically for services which don't really exist anymore? If I was running a corporate group, I can definitely see the point of continuing to churn out a minimal print publication at a London Borough area with no local journalism in it to scoop up the public notice income, because that's a logical reaction to the market, and that doesn't make people involved bad or evil, but it does mean that we should change that market, because that stuff is there as a subsidy. Public notices are there as a subsidy, but currently in that setup, they're not subsidising journalism. They're subsidising a minimal bit of infrastructure which tiny numbers of people are reading. So that's a problem. But I think in terms of the broader thing, though, there's definitely a question of managed decline versus, in effect, managed growth. And the question for me is looking at not so much railing against what corporate operators are doing, but more saying, is there any way that we can look at what they're currently doing and actually operate that from the opposite direction? So can we look at, if we were going to start doing publications in additional London boroughs, what's the minimum level we can start at and then build something up? So, we might start a new publication which operates at a broadly similar level to what some of the corporates do. So we might not put a huge amount of editorial resource initially into a new publication, but then as that publication establishes itself at a minimum level, then gradually build it up and then find what is the maximum level of resource you can generate in that given area for journalism, and then look to how we spend that resource on creating a better and better product from a lower starting point. So I think that's kind of how I look at it. I think ultimately my thinking on this is local news doesn't have to be bad. The products don't have to be as poor as some of the products currently are, based on the money that is sloshing around in the system or the money that is reasonably available. So it's how do we get the maximum possible resource directed at supporting genuine, local journalism.
It's all very well bemoaning the current state of the market, but what can we do to fix it? That's a question we hope to address over the following 3 episodes by looking at which companies have found resilient business models, what needs to change internally, and what tools are helping future-proof local media. For now, though, I want to finish this episode by looking at what vision our interviewees have for the local news landscape. Here's the Public Interest News Foundation's Jonathan Harewood.
So we did this really interesting project where we went around the country, went to 6 different communities, and sort of rather than us saying, well, we know what we think good local news looks like, we tried to ask local people, and we talked about their memories of local news, those that were a certain age that had memories of local news, about what they thought about it at present and what they thought it should be like in future. In terms of the memories, if you are above a certain age and you grew up when there was a sort of vibrant local newspaper, you probably at some point saw yourself in the paper. And that was quite a big moment. So for me, like my primary school won some kind of road safety competition, and the photographer came from the Yorkshire Evening Press. And there we are out in the playground holding up this trophy, looking like idiots. And I remember him like perched on the wall of the playground taking this photo. And it's a really kind of special moment because, there we are in the school playground where I am spending all my life. And then suddenly there I am on the pages of this newspaper, along with other stories about the York City football team and the council and the Minster. And it's like, I see I'm part of something bigger than just this little playground. And loads of people have got stories like that when they were in sports competitions or music concerts or whatever. So there's a generation of basically sort of 40 or above that have those memories. The generation below that doesn't really have any particular sense of local news. Local news at present, what people really, really, really yearn for is a sense of sort of boots on the ground, that, reporters are actually there. So a lot of it, it's hard to put in terms of the actual content of the stories. It's not necessarily what people are looking for is, I think the story should be sort of a nice 3,000 word kind of long form. I mean, so you see that at the Manchester Mill, that's what they do. They do it brilliantly. Maybe that's a model that works in other places, or maybe that's just a particular niche that they've met with a particular audience. It's not so much the common thread. It's about relationships. We want people that we know and trust. people love the idea of having newsrooms that are present in the area. So what Rhiannon Davies is doing in Govan Hill with her community newsroom, I think, is a brilliant example. They've taken over a small space just off the high street. Anyone can drop in. They use it for co-working. They use it for events. It actually is a revenue generator for the organisation, and it does fantastic work about building trust and visibility. So I think people are crying out for innovations like that. I think there is a general sense people would like, they don't use the term, but I think what they're talking about is solutions journalism. They do not like to see their area constantly put in a bad light, and it's all about kind of crime and traffic accidents. People feel like that just, okay, maybe it's all true, and maybe those stories need to be in the mix, but is it the only thing to have in the mix? You know, it's like having a cake that's only made with sort of salt or something. It's like, where's the sugar? You know, where's the butter? Where are the eggs? Where are all the nice ingredients as well go to make up the sense of having some place that you might be proud of?
Social Spider has its own view of good local news, and it tries to build this into its operating practices, as David Floyd explains.
There's three strands for us. I mean, there's the one that gets a lot of the recognition and is in the Cairncross Review's definition of public interest news, which is really about the holding authority to account at a local level. So scrutinising the activities of local councils and other public sector agencies and big businesses at a local level, so that things that are going on which are important to the public and important to society, but aren't necessarily going to generate millions of clicks beyond that local area are reported on by journalists. So that element, the scrutiny element, is really, really important. I think alongside that, there's a community understanding element of making sure that, or giving the opportunity for people to know what's going on in their local area in a broader sense. So we're not so much now in the situation of, can your local newspaper tell you whether there's been a fire down the road or that kind of thing. I think it's fine. The local Facebook group can take that on there. That's not what local newspapers need to do. Certainly the weekly or monthly ones. But it's understanding what's going on in the sense of understanding who lives in the community, understanding what are the community organisations and activities that are going on, what are the local campaigns, what is the experience of living in your local area like for other people who live in the local area. And that in terms of that sense of belonging for people, that element of understanding and generating that sense of belonging is massively important. And the third one is in terms of voice, and it's amplifying those voices in local communities that otherwise get ignored.
Now, good local news and sustainable local news aren't necessarily the same thing. In some countries, local coverage is heavily subsidised by grants or philanthropic donations. But is there a viable business model without these?
Whether publications could be sustainable at a borough level in a broader sense is a slightly different question, because to some extent it depends on how much that borough really wants a publication in terms of the combination of local residents and businesses and public sector agencies. So in Waltham Forest, where we've been going the longest in terms of our publications, that is our most successful publication in terms of income. And that's partly because we have the biggest number of supporters, individual people paying on a monthly basis. I think there's around 300 people in Waltham Forest. So that gives a big starting point, that there's a decent chunk of money coming in, whatever happens with any of the other more commercial elements. But then it's also that there's a wider group of local charities and small businesses and others who are recognising the paper and are continuing to advertise in it. And we're not within the group of publishers who are mourning the loss of all our lovely money that was taken away when Google and Facebook and other social media platforms arrived. Because we started in 2014, we never had all that lovely money. It's always been a case of, how do we deal with what's there? How do we deal as best we can with the market that exists? And over the past sort of 9 years, we've been getting better at doing that. We've been getting better at delivering value both to readers and to local advertisers. So at the moment, we still have a slight upward trajectory, but there's obviously going to be, particularly in terms of print advertising, there's going to be a plateau for that. There's not going to be a reversal in the way that markets for print advertising work, but there definitely is enough money at a London borough level to do decent publications for each borough to do something which involves employing at least one journalist locally. But whether you can do more than that, currently, if we had public notice income, we could employ 2 or 3 journalists at a London borough level. I don't see a route back to the situation where publications were employing 5 or 6 journalists to produce a weekly paper in the London borough. That seems unlikely, unless very large numbers of people decide they, as readers, want to pay for it. And it's not impossible. I mean, if 2,000 or 3,000 people at a London borough level decided they want to pay £5 a month for a paper, then you could create an amazing product. But currently, we're not very close to that happening.
When looking at a playbook for good local news, we also need to acknowledge that in many cases, things are not as bad as we like to make out. Table stakes, as Doug Smith explains.
But in the US, there's a tendency to use the same story that's been used for over 20 years. Things are falling apart. So many journalists are losing their jobs. We have news deserts everywhere, or we have zombie news sites everywhere. The situation is dire. Democracy itself is actually down for the 10 count in the boxing ring and about to die. This is the story. This is the story. Very importantly, there's a cultural trope within journalists of wanting to control the narrative, wanting to know what the narrative is and present the narrative. That's the narrative. And it's a narrative that persists in the US almost every time I read something, it's the same narrative. What's striking to me is that the facts on the ground don't match the narrative. Now, are there news deserts that continue to grow? Yes. Are there journalists who lose jobs? Yes. Are there journalists who get jobs? Yes. Are there local newspapers who've turned themselves around? Yes. Is local news still more trusted than any other news source, both in the US and in Europe? Yes. Are there examples of pretty amazing success and innovation that are happening? Yes. So the narrative is not so black and white as it's been told for 20 years. It's a little kind of confusing, to tell you the truth, about why the biggest voices seem to be immune from sharing a narrative that's a little bit more nuanced, a lot more nuanced, and crucially more hopeful.
Talking of hope, there's even hope in news of the breakdown of some of the bigger companies opening up opportunities. This is something we've seen in both the UK and US, where the wider decline has spurred the formation of startups to both fill gaps and take on established titles with what they see as better coverage. Dr. Vibke Moving explains.
Over the last couple of, let's say, 10 years, we see that the monopoly of local newspapers serving local news to people, it's vanished. And that's a good thing on the one hand side. It's because every company, every party, every interest group has now the possibility to get their news directly to the users. I think it's a good way from a democratic perspective. If, and that's then maybe the problem on the other hand side, if it's proper information. And people have to learn to evaluate the sources, and they have to learn which information they can trust on and which information is maybe framed with a certain perspective. And we see often that this evaluation is not going very well. So people beliefs in news, or maybe not let us use the word news there, let us use the word information there. they think every information is a proper journalistic news. That is a problem. And I think from all of this, and that comes to your question then, all of this is because of maybe all the frustration that is going on about how to get proper information and proper news. The trust and the need for qualitative and professional journalism can arise. For certain groups in our society, maybe it's too late. I don't know if we can reach with journalism every target group or every group in the society in a proper way. And that is, I think, that is the thing where news houses now, on a point, they have to decide, maybe it is not the way anymore with one product fits all. They have to try to find ways to get the same information, but in different ways, and distributed to different groups of people, because they read different, they have to frame it a little bit different, they have to put it in another perspective.
Dr. Vibke is generally optimistic about the future of local information, but is less certain about paid local news, although she does have hope.
I think you can definitely see a high need. I don't know, maybe you had the same in UK during Corona. There was a highly need of local information. What is going on in my city, in my neighborhood, in my community? How can I behave in a proper way, or how I have to behave? And all these questions, and there was a highly need of trusting, of information that are credible and that you can trust on. And I think local news companies should really try to be worth the credibility that people till now give them. So it's a little bit mixed, but I really hope that my grandchild will have a news source. I wouldn't say a newspaper, but a news source with a professional and credible background.
Some of the research the Public Interest News Foundation are doing shows that many local news organisations are on the path to sustainability, but this path needs speeding up, as Jonathan Hewood explains.
So we've got two major strands of research. One is the annual index that we've been doing for 3 years now. So that's an index of the independent sector. And by independent, we simply mean outlets in the UK with turnover below £2 million that are publishing public interest news, loosely defined, on a regular basis. So that we're into the third year of that now. We're starting to see some trends coming through. So, I mean, the first big takeaway is that these organisations are really quite small. So typical turnover is £89,000 a year. Now that's actually skewed upwards by the outlets in the sector which are aiming at a more national or even international audience, sites like The Conversation or Open Democracy or Byline Times, which are doing, sort of deeper, more investigative, more political journalism. They might be generating in revenue in the hundreds of thousands or even in the low millions. But below that is the local part of the sector, which tends to have much lower turnover than 89,000, employs sort of 2.5 people, heavily reliant on volunteers. But it is growing. It's growing at a very modest rate over those few years that we've been doing it. We've seen growth of sort of 10-20%. So if you continue on that trajectory, by about the middle of this century, you get to a point where you've got a bunch of sustainable news organisations. I guess our concern is that we haven't really got that long to wait. And what can we do to accelerate growth in the next few years, not the next few decades? But there are promising signs.
I want to wrap up with a few final big picture thoughts on local news. The first is from Doug Smith, who wants to remind us that direct relationships are a gift that we shouldn't take for granted.
What's fascinating, and again, to me, so hopeful, about the effort underway to revitalize local news in the 21st century is that one way of thinking about it is that the whole newsroom and their colleagues and the business and everything were like focused on a door, a physical object, a door that was the printed paper. On the other side of that door was the general public, but our whole focus was on the door. In today's world, with an audience's first approach, there are no doors. There's direct relationship with real people about what matters in their lives. This is a gift of enormous, enormous proportions to journalists. It's a gift. And we're saying, grab it.
Bénédicte Autray also had some final advice from her time working with local news organisations at Google.
I would say start speaking to your readers and trying to find out what they want. Because it struck me that, that feedback loop doesn't exist very much. But from speaking to a few of the CEOs in local news here in the UK, this doesn't strike me as something that is happening systematically. And so to me, if you understand what your readers' needs are, then you can design your strategy that will give you more sustainable revenue models.
It's also important to remember that one of the complexities, but also the beauties of local news, is that there's not one model that will work for each country or even each region.
What is true in the south of England might be completely different from Liverpool or Manchester or Leeds. The community's makeup is very different depending on where you go. And the challenges and the opportunities, the good stories are very different from one region to the other. So what might be true everywhere is that you should not rely on one revenue model, but have a healthy revenue mix.
That's all for this episode. Thank you so much to our guests for their input and to my co-host Peter Houston for the many hours he spent conducting the interviews. If this is your first introduction to Media Voices, then hello, it's lovely to have you. We publish 3 seasons of interviews with the leading media guests each year, the first of which is starting in a couple of weeks for 2024. We also have a daily newsletter, online community forum, reports and regular analysis published over on our website, voices.media. And if you're not new here, welcome back. A final thanks to the Google News Initiative, who are supporting this series. They work with publishers and journalists to fight misinformation, share resources, and build a diverse and innovative news ecosystem. You can find out more about their programmes, tools and resources at newsinitiative.withgoogle.com. We'll be back next Wednesday with the second part of this series, looking at the publishers working to find resilient business models, the opportunities and challenges they're facing, the importance of good content, and building communities. Until then, goodbye.